Even when Heath tried a joke about Wilson's brand new technology ministry, he was smoothly trumped.
The Minister of Technology is no tiger. That is now plain. The Prime Minister has put a tortoise in the tank. I was grateful for the Right Honourable Gentleman for that memorable phrase about the tortoise in the tank. I must say that I liked that. I liked it the first time I saw it in a Sunday Citizen cartoon on the 27th of June. I'm sure that the House will always be ready to hear the Right Honourable Gentleman again, especially if he keeps reminding us of that phrase.
Wilson sort of waltzed round him, and he was just witty. Ted resented this. Ted was not good at being laughed at.
Ted had this rather, at once bland and pompous manner. It's difficult to be bland and pompous simultaneously, but Ted Heath managed it, and always felt he was brushing Harold aside, swatting him. But whilst he attempted to swat him, he always missed.
Wilson, I think it's fair to say, he really despised Ted Heath. I can hear him saying to me now, down the years, "Heath, I could knock him around the room any day I like," this kind of thing.
The personal animosity was palpable to MPs watching them.
Once in the House of Commons, there was a slagging match going on between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and Manny Shinwell chipped in rather wistfully from the back bench. "Is this a private matter, or can we join in?" I think that was the feeling of slight worry on the part of Heath's followers, that it was a private matter.
Heath, perhaps, was not the attack weapon his supporters had hoped for, and his lack of ease came as a shock to them. One of his previous jobs had been Chief Whip, where he was remembered as being gregarious and sociable. But once elected Leader of the Opposition, he began to display an alarming brusqueness.
Can you make any comment at all this morning, Mr. Heath? I think it's all so far.
Congratulations. Thank you very much.
Anthony Howard went to visit him on holiday in France for a Sunday Times feature.
He greeted me without any great enthusiasm, I think, and said something like, "I suppose you'd like a drink." I said, "Well, that's a very good idea, thank you very much. What would you like to have?" I said, "Well, is there any whiskey?" And so he went to a very nasty plywood sort of sideboard, opened the door, looked at a half bottle of whiskey, saw it was really pretty nearly empty, and said, "You better have coffee."
Heath may well have intended it as a joke, but as his friends acknowledge, his mordant sense of humour was an acquired taste.
Mentally, he was very, very sharp. Sharp is the word, because often he said things which were meant to be slightly humorous. He cracked a joke. He rather like Prince Philip in this respect, cracked a joke in order to make a joke, and then was amazed when people took it very seriously.
He had the best sense of humour, as well concealed as anybody's ever been able to conceal that sense of humour. But what was so dementing is his ability to present himself in the most angular possible form gave one homicidal feelings about him quite often.
You're not even old enough to remember what was going on when we came into power. There was food rationing and sweets rationing. You were just old enough to eat sweets, and you had to queue up with a little coupon in order to buy them. That was the situation when we came into power.
It was actually a wooden leg that he wore all his life. The more he latched on to the things that he wanted to do in life, the more the wooden leg, this wooden manner, came into play.
We said, relax, be yourself. Well, advice never went really down well, because I think he wasn't sure what himself was. He didn't have a ready-made persona. He didn't have a switch which he could turn on in a way that many politicians did, which Harold Wilson certainly did.
The image-conscious Wilson was always ready to milk the latest trend. In 1965, it was the new age of pop.
You to me are sweet as roses in the morning.
Thank you very much for giving us this Silver Heart. But I still think you should have given one to good old Mr. Wilson.
concrete, and the clay beneath my feet begins to crumble.
Wilson had entered Downing Street promising a whirlwind of activity. He even compared himself to America's most recent political hero.
What I think we're going to need is something like what President Kennedy had when he came in after years of stagnation in the United States. He had a program of 100 days of dynamic action.
It was felt that the government could do more by greater intervention when Labour came in. So almost every month there'd be some form of tinkering with the economy to try to get the level of activity exactly right. I was Secretary of the Budget Committee at the time, and we used to be almost in constant session.
In spite of his awkwardness, Heath could sometimes score a laugh, and Wilson's hyperactivity gave him an early chance.
Comrades, we are raising our productivity in the Cabinet. A budget in March, a budget in May, a budget in July.
But despite his much vaunted economic planning, Wilson from the very beginning found himself at the mercy of events. He was buffeted by pressure on the pound, which then was set at a fixed exchange rate. The obvious solution was to devalue it. But Wilson was haunted by the previous Labour government's devaluation in 1948.
It was a very odd thing in a way in those days that we regarded the value of the pound as almost a test of virtue in politics. And so devaluation was almost a sin. And that was absolutely ridiculous.
While the weak pound was the rod across Wilson's back, Heath's, from the very outset, was the whisperers in his own party. Private Eye had named him the grocer. Heath had once been president of the Board of Trade. But for large sections of the Tory party, that encapsulated a disdain of the grammar school boy with strange-sounding vowels, who couldn't even beat his opponent.
The stupid people turned on him and began to mock his background and mock his the past that he came from, and say, well, that's the sort of thing when you elect a grammar school boy, that's the sort of thing you get.
And I knew quite a grand Tory lady who was the wife of the chairman of the party, Lord Blakenham. And I remember her saying to me, of course, what we all have to face about Ted, it's not his fault, poor dear, but he hasn't got any manners.
Heath's highly personal duel with Wilson and the savaging he was receiving in the House of Commons began to have a significant psychological impact. He retreated into his shell, comfortable only with his trusted circle of close advisors and friends.
It was politics at its juvenile playpen worst. What I didn't realise until looking back on it, it made an appalling and searing and lasting impression on Ted.
Wilson was oozing confidence. In spring 1966, with his new opponent posing so little threat, his highly tuned political antennae sensed that the time was ripe to increase his slender majority, before events began to overtake him.
Harold timed it exactly. I remember talking to Roy Jenkins saying, when's the election going to come? And Roy saying, don't you and I worry about it. We can do some things. But the man who will choose the election date to the absolute nth degree, it will be perfect into the next date, is Harold Wilson.
For Harold Wilson, unlike Ted Heath, elections and the razzmatazz surrounding them were the stuff of life, ever since he'd first entered Parliament in 1945.
He was political to his fingertips. I once said to him, I was talking politics to him, and he said it had always been his worry in 1953 when the King died. He feared that Winston Churchill would take advantage of that and call a quick general election. And I said, I was too young to think like that in those days, Howard. Were you? He said, I thought like that since the day I was born.
The 1966 election trail threw Wilson and Heath's very different styles onto streets and TV screens across the country.
That's where the mismatch between Harold and Ted came out. One, the political arc lamps came on full at the glimmer of being seen by outsiders or the public. Whereas in Ted, the arc lights tended to go off. It's tragically ludicrous.
And the first point I want to make to you is that yesterday there was yet another warning from the Building Societies Association that the mortgage rates must rise again.
Now, Mr. Chairman, just to break for a moment before I turn to the other subject I want to deal with, the half-time scores are as follows.
It was a terrible campaign. We were fighting a losing battle the whole way through the campaign.
Wilson sat back and enjoyed the ride, rarely deigning even to engage with his opponent.
After all these words, what has been the result in productivity? Just 1%. One miserable 1%. Well, is Mr. Wilson proud of it? Apparently not. You think he is? Well, then ask him why he doesn't come onto television and face me there and argue it out.
I would never put him on an equal level with him. He would certainly never have agreed to have a television debate or anything like that with him.
Wilson was a masterly electioneer, partly by ostentatiously appearing everywhere with his wife and ever making perfectly clear that poor old Heath, as bachelor, didn't understand what was going on.
Heath's bachelor status was another gift to the Whisperers. In private, Wilson relished alluding to it.
When he made a speech once about the importance of family, Harold's only remark was, those who don't play the game shouldn't make the rules.
All these rumours about how he might be homosexual, totally without foundation as far as I'm concerned, but they certainly swirled around these rumours. My feeling, for what it's worth, and I'm not medically qualified, is that he was one of those people, they do exist, he was pretty asexual, it just didn't interest him.
Well, let's say we average them out to around 4.5%, which is the average of these four national polls, pointing to something like 150 majority, which is about...
On March the 31st, 1966, in the first of their 4 general election battles, Wilson humiliated Heath. Labour's majority over the Conservatives was well over 100. And in the summer of '66, it seemed that Britain was rocking.
Sunshine came softly through my window today. Could have tripped out easy, but I've changed my way.
England, for the first time, even managed to win the World Cup.
England's victory in the 1966 World Cup is now taken as a kind of high point of the 1960s. So we think that 66 is the kind of culmination of swinging London and the optimism and change and whatnot. But I think there's a nice coincidence because the day after England's victory in the World Cup final is the day that the Colonial Office, the great kind of symbol, if you like, of British imperialism and British power, closes its doors for the last time.
We'd won the war, but at great cost. We were living with the end of empire, and there were people about, including senior civil servants, who saw what we were doing as the management of decline. Wilson was much closer to those who thought we were in the business of managing decline than Heath was. I think Heath had greater optimism.
Once again, it was the weak pound that seemed the overwhelming symbol of decline. In the autumn of 1967, Wilson and his Chancellor James Callaghan were finally forced into devaluation. What concerned Wilson more than anything was how to present this surrender to the British people.
That morning I'd been rung by a brother-in-law from Leeds, and he had said, "Is my money in the bank going to be devalued? Will be it worth as much as it was yesterday?" So when Harold was doing the pound in your pocket or in your purse,